residents of a closed Soviet city heard an explosion and didn't even look up. Construction blasting was routine there. Nobody ran. Nobody was evacuated. A few hours later, the night sky over the Ural Mountains turned a deep, glowing red, and some residents later said it reminded them of the Northern Lights. What actually lit that sky was one of the worst nuclear disasters in human history. And the Soviet Union hid it from the world for 30 years. This is the Kyshtym disaster. Unlike most of the cases on this channel, this one isn't a mystery of missing evidence. Every fact is documented. The mystery here is different. How a nuclear catastrophe releasing radiation on the scale of Chernobyl simply vanished from every map, every newspaper, and nearly every Soviet citizen's knowledge for 3 decades. The story starts with a place that officially did not exist. In the late 1940s, the Soviet Union raced to build its first atomic bomb, and it built the facility to do it in the Ural Mountains at a chemical combine given the deliberately bland cover name Mayak, meaning lighthouse. The city built to house its workers had no name on any map. Officials called it Chelyabinsk 40, a postal code standing in for an entire city of scientists, engineers, and their families, sealed behind fences and guarded checkpoints. If you were born there, your birth certificate listed a different city entirely. The place simply was not supposed to exist. Mayak's job was producing weapons-grade plutonium, and that process generates enormous volumes of high-level radioactive waste. In the earliest, most rushed years of the Soviet nuclear program, that waste was stored in enormous steel tanks buried underground, cooled by water circulating through pipes around each container. The waste stayed radioactive and dangerously hot for years. The cooling system was the only thing standing between contained waste and disaster. By 1957, one of those tanks, tank number 14, held about 80 cubic meters of high-level waste. Its cooling system had failed. Instrumentation to monitor the tank's internal temperature had also failed, and nobody replaced it. For weeks, maybe longer, the waste inside sat quietly overheating with no working way to know it, evaporating its own coolant, drying out, concentrating into an unstable chemical mixture beneath a slab of reinforced concrete. On September 29, 1957, at 4:22 in the afternoon, the tank exploded. Investigators later concluded it was a thermal explosion, essentially the dried, overheated nitrate and acetate salts detonating like a chemical bomb, not a nuclear chain reaction. The blast was estimated at the equivalent of dozens of tons of TNT. It threw the tank's 1-meter-thick, 160-ton concrete lid through the air like a piece of paper, and it launched an estimated 20 million curies of radioactive material into the atmosphere. For scale, Chernobyl 29 years later released around 50 million curies, but over a wider, faster, more famous burn. Kyshtym's release, concentrated over a single facility, contaminated roughly 1,000 square kilometers of Soviet territory in a matter of hours. The following days revealed the true scale of denial. There was no public warning. There was no announcement in Soviet media, not that week, not that year. Workers within the plant were evacuated and treated, some for radiation exposure, severe enough to be immediately life-threatening. But dozens of villages downwind, home to over 10,000 people, received no instructions at all for days. Some accounts describe villagers told to plow contaminated soil under, literally mixing radioactive fallout deeper into the ground they farmed and lived on, because no one in authority understood or admitted what had actually happened. Eventually, quietly, evacuations began. Over the following 2 years, Soviet authorities relocated more than 10,000 people from the most contaminated areas. Entire villages were bulldozed after their populations left, their names removed from regional maps as thoroughly as Chelyabinsk 40 itself had been. One village, Muslimovo, sat along a river that had already been used for years as a dumping ground for the plant's liquid waste, and its population lived with contamination for decades after the tank explosion made global headlines under a different name. And that name is the strangest detail in the entire case. The disaster happened at a secret facility with no name on any map. So when whispers of it eventually reached the outside world, Soviet officials and Western observers alike needed some name to refer to it by. They chose Kyshtym. the nearest town that was actually allowed to appear on a map. A quiet settlement roughly 15 kilometers away that had nothing to do with the accident at all. To this day, the worst nuclear disaster in Ural history carries the name of a town that wasn't involved in it, because the town that was involved in it officially didn't exist. For 30 years, the Soviet state maintained total silence. The first detailed account to reach the West came in 1976 from a Soviet dissident scientist living in exile who published what evidence he could gather. Western intelligence agencies and even some scientists dismissed his account for years as exaggerated or impossible to verify. It wasn't until 1989, under the openness policies of the late Soviet Union, that the government finally, officially confirmed the disaster had happened. By then, the human cost had been building silently for over 3 decades. Studies conducted after the region opened to scientific inquiry documented elevated rates of leukemia and other cancers among people who lived along the contaminated river system, among plant workers, and among the liquidators sent in to manage the aftermath. Estimates of related deaths and long-term health impacts remain disputed and difficult to pin down precisely, in part because the very secrecy that hid the disaster also prevented proper long-term medical tracking of the people it affected. Mayak still operates today, one of Russia's key nuclear reprocessing facilities, in a city now openly named Ozyorsk, still a closed administrative territory that outsiders cannot enter without special permission. The lake used for decades to dump the plant's liquid waste, Lake Karachay, became at one point so radioactive that standing at its shore, unshielded for about an hour, would have delivered a fatal dose. It has since been filled with concrete and rock to seal it permanently. So where does the mystery lie in a disaster this thoroughly documented? Not in what happened. That part is settled science. The mystery is what a modern nation-state can erase, and for how long. A city removed from every map. A cause of death withheld from doctors treating patients whose real diagnosis was radiation sickness. Villages bulldozed and renamed out of existence. A disaster labeled with the name of a town that had nothing to do with it, specifically so the real location could stay hidden. 30 years of silence, broken not by an official admission, but by a defector's testimony that the world spent over a decade refusing to believe. Kyshtym is a reminder that the most effective cover-up in history wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was a filing cabinet, a fabricated postal code, and 30 years of nobody asking the right question out loud. What strikes you most about this case? The accident itself, or the 30 years of silence that followed it? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe, because next time we go back into the mountains to a disappearance in the Pamirs where the searchers found the campsite and nothing else.